Now let's take a look at the other macroeconomic school of thought based diagram. And this, of course, is called the Keynesian aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram. It is as important as the neoclassical model, and it kind of depends on the teacher in which you have. And in my world here, teaching IB economics in Santiago, I like the neoclassical model because I feel like it's more useful and more flexible to use at any sort of question if you're not asked to provide a specific diagram. Other teachers completely disagree with me. They think Keynes is easier and better to show whatever you need to show, whether it be economic growth or lack of growth or inflation or unemployment. Either way, it doesn't really matter because they're constructed in the sense very similarly and they can be used in a very similar fashion. And so it's just a matter of your preference, okay? So the Keynesian aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram must be memorized. Memorized, memorized, memorized. And these are the two diagrams really, in equity and the distribution of income at the end of this whole course. There's one more diagram that you kind of have to memorize, but that's just it, because what I suggest that you do as you go through your studies of economics is not memorize diagrams. It's impossible. There are too many of them. What you need to identify are what are the base diagrams and then understand how they behave if some new event were to happen, okay? So one base diagram is that neoclassical rule of 10 that I just taught you, and now we're going to take a look at the Keynesian aggregate demand, aggregate supply rule of 9, okay? Now, I also realize that some of this is a bit repetitive because as we went through our last unit, right, we were looking at this because in order to understand aggregate supply in isolation and aggregate demand in isolation, you have to use these diagrams, okay? But guess what? The rule of 9, the Keynesian model, has the same labels, right? A title for a particular country, so the country of Brazil, you know, the economy of Brazil, the economy of Mexico, the economy of the Dominican Republic, the economy of Haiti, the economy of Canada, the economy of New Zealand, okay, or Fiji. Then the average price level, make sure that the currency is in relationship, is the same as the country you choose. Don't mess that up. That's such a silly mistake, and a lot of students make that mistake. So if you're going to use the dollar, this better be the market for the United States or Panama or Ecuador because they use the US dollar. Then we're going to have zero. Then we're going to have real GDP, as I mentioned. This could be national output. This could be real output. I like real GDP because GDP is a reference, at least in my head, to aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is going to be the most active, curve on this diagram, and therefore correlating it with real GDP, at least in my mind, makes sense. Okay, so now, how are we going to draw this thing? All right, well, we are going to think about the aggregate supply curve as starting off, and this is important, perfectly elastic, then bending and going perfectly inelastic, okay? And this is going to be AS1, okay? That is the aggregate supply curve for Keynes. And remember, in Keynes, there is no short run and long run. There's just aggregate supply, okay? Then, from there, we are going to also include the aggregate demand curve. And now the best place to draw this, I think, in the beginning, is so that it crosses over right there, which would mean, let me label this first. This is AD1, okay, which means that the economy is operating at its optimal level of output, and that optimal level of output is represented by the fact that this AD curve, and I'm going to label this Y1, okay, and then we're going to have a average price level of PL1. Okay, and so there it is. There is the Keynesian supply and aggregate demand diagram. The reason it's important to draw the aggregate demand curve intersecting the aggregate supply curve right as it goes vertically or inelastic is that that is the same analogous point to where aggregate demand crosses the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is at the full level of employment. Remember, Y1 represents the full level of employment. And as I said in the last video, and I'll repeat it just so you remember, I feel like, and I would suggest that you do this over whatever your textbook says or over whatever even your teacher says, to label this Y1 and that PL1. The reason is that when you are going through economic scenarios, you have a base situation and then you have an event. And we just logically start counting from 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. We don't start with F or E or some other, asterisk. We start with a number. And so you're going to want to know for your analysis where the story began in the first place. And that's why labeling this Y1 and PL1 and that AS1 and that AD1, even though they might not shift, that roots you in where the story began. Because actually, as you get into this, it can be very complicated to remember, like, oh, wait, where was the original equilibrium point? Okay, so there you have it. Now let's clean that up a little bit. And what you have here, and what I did to make it look all nice and cute, is I actually used part of this diagram is, better said, what changed on this diagram is right here in real output. And that's just to show you that you could have real GDP here, or you could have real output, you could have national income, okay? But what you'll see is that we have, count them up, my friends, 1, that is average price level, right? 2 is the currency, 3 is PL1, 4 is the origin, 5 is Y1, 6 is real output or real GDP, 7 is AD1, 8 is AS1, and the title is 9. And there you have it, the Keynesian aggregate demand, aggregate supply base diagram. So how is this useful? It's useful because, as I've said to you over and over and over again, you can't memorize all these diagrams, so you have to root yourself in the beginning. This is the beginning of your economic analysis of some economic event. It starts here and then aggregate demand drops off. Or it starts here and aggregate supply moves out because of some change in the quality or the quantity of the factors of production. Like, this is the beginning. And no matter what you need to show, inflation, unemployment, economic growth, like, they all start here. And that way, you don't memorize things, you just know. And in IB economics, if you're an IB student, guess what, dude? Like, there's only one curve that shifts, ever. There's never 2 curves that actually shift, that you have to do an analysis. You do one and one curve shifts and you put your pencil down and you're like, okay, now I got to analyze that. Okay, so if you know this rule of 9 and you know the neoclassical rule of 10, you're good for no matter what question they ask you. And I'm not talking about just in this unit, but I'm talking about low unemployment, low and stable rate of inflation, or economic growth. All right, my friends, there it is. The Keynesian rule of 9. Know it, practice it, because this is something that's critical for your studies. All right, my friends, and we are rolling on to the next video.